So here's a map of the Aegean, and as I mentioned earlier, after the defeat of the Persians, the Athenians were the ones who filled up the power vacuum they left here. One might have expected the Spartans to take over, but again, they were not imperialistic in outlook. And they also were not a strong enough naval power to establish the kind of presence Athens could among the islands and along the coasts. As we've seen, the Delian or Athenian League, nominally established as a defense alliance against Persia, soon became a de facto Athenian empire, with the treasury serving to beautify Athens and further strengthen the fleet which collected the taxes that went into it. In 435, however, when Athens made an alliance with Corcyra, modern Corfu on the west side of Greece, this expansion of Athenian influence to the west led the Spartans to act. To abbreviate something complicated, this alliance also got Athens in trouble with Corinth, because Corinth was involved in a conflict with Corcyra. And when the Athenians demanded that the city of Potidaea, which was paying taxes to Athens, but technically under the control of Corinth, send the latter's representatives somewhere else, Sparta issued an ultimatum to the effect that if Athens attacked Potidaea, Sparta would besiege Athens. Athens did attack, and eventually at great cost did take Potidaea. And by 431, according to J.B. Bury anyway, there's some controversy about dates here, the Spartan army had begun its siege of Athens. This is a portrait of Pericles now, who at the time of these events was the most influential man in Athens. He was elected strategos of his tribe in 467 at 28, and although there were always 9 other men who held the same position in their precincts, his charisma and political ability got him re-elected year after year and made him the dominant figure he was for so long, despite the fact that he was, while a competent military man, no great general, no Napoleon, nor Lord Nelson either, although the development of the power of the fleet is often attributed to him. He is certainly entitled to be called a great patron of the arts, though, as the main force behind Phidias and the rebuilding of the Parthenon, and he was a friend and supporter of dramatists like Sophocles, as well as of philosophers like Zeno and Anaxagoras, but it's a bit hard to understand the real secret of his power. This is a tombstone of some anonymous citizen now, with Athena mourning. One of the most famous passages in Thucydides is the speech attributed to Pericles called the Funeral Oration, although it may have as much of Thucydides in it as it does Pericles. It was meant to honor those who died fighting on behalf of Athens, and was apparently delivered in 431. In it, Pericles emphasizes that while the Athenians may not be as fine soldiers as the Spartans, the latter are only soldiers, whereas the Athenians are finer men. Athens is the Greece of Greece, the center of Greek civilization. It's the place where the finest things produced in all the arts can be enjoyed, and where a citizen is free to think and determine his own fate. The Athenian, he says, has the power of adapting himself to the most varied forms of human activity with versatility and grace. In effect, Pericles is describing the Athenian as a Renaissance man before the Renaissance. Thucydides, essentially his contemporary, admired him very much, as did Plutarch, who wrote his biography of him hundreds of years later. Some modern historians, though, do criticize what's taken to be at least his imperialism, and they blame him for the war with Sparta that led to Athens' downfall. And by 430, it's clear that many Athenians were blaming him for the mess they were in, too. This is an ostracon with his name on it, and although there were never enough votes to banish him from the city, he was temporarily suspended by the assembly in that year 430 from his position as strategos. In response to the Spartan siege, he'd refused to lead the army out, which he felt would be overmatched, and tried to bring the whole population of Attica behind the walls of Athens, which overcrowded the city, the misery of which was exacerbated by an outbreak of the plague, which killed 2 of his sons and may have led to his own death in 429. In this picture, you're looking from the Acropolis toward the Aegean and the Athenian harbor at Piraeus, which was connected to the city by the famous long walls, part of the program of Themistocles to strengthen the city. The south wall ran over the top of the Hill of the Muses, as it's called, just this side of the monument you see there, the so-called monument to Philopappos, a 2nd century A.D. Athenian who became a Roman consul. It was from there, incidentally, that the Venetians fired the shell that blew up the Parthenon in 1687. Despite the Spartan siege, the fact that the city was connected to the harbor by these walls allowed the Athenians to import food and to go about the policing of their empire anyway. It was a strange war for a long time because the Athenians refused to fight the Spartans on land, and the Spartans had no fleet with which to interdict Athenian tax collectors. One was all army, the other all navy. Some of the tributaries in the empire did, however, try to take advantage of what was certainly a difficult situation for Athens, and in 428, one of the first big events of the war took place when the city of Mytilene on Lesbos stopped its payments. Here you can see Mytilene today. Cleon, who became the leading Athenian hawk after the death of Pericles, immediately argued for the severe punishment of the place, saying, in effect, "We've been protecting them from the Persians for 50 years, and now when we're in trouble they stab us in the back." In response to this, a fleet was sent to massacre the whole population. Then, however, a fellow named Diodotus presented an interesting argument. "True," he said, "these people have betrayed us, and we would be justified in inflicting the worst on them. But just as this would be, it's not in the interest of Athens. It would make our other tributaries think that if there were any disagreement that they might as well fight to the last man because we would kill them all anyway. It may not be just, but it's in our interest to be lenient." This argument now carried the day. A ship was sent to modify the original plan, and only the ringleaders of the rebellion were executed. Thucydides' discussion of this business is often considered the first significant treatment of the moral and or practical social value of capital punishment. In 425, one of the most famous events in the war took place when an Athenian fleet under Demosthenes established a beachhead on the west coast of the Peloponnesus itself, much to the anger of the Spartans. The original Athenian position was at Pylos, to the south of which is the island of Sphacteria. The Spartans sent ships to try to dislodge the invaders, but the Athenians defeated this effort, and about 420 Spartans were marooned on the island. In this view from the mainland, looking west, you can see Pylos at the right now and the island of Sphacteria to the left. The Spartans, under their general Brasidas, now mounted a campaign to supply the 420 men on the island with food and water, while the Athenians sailed back and forth from the bay to try to prevent this and starve them into surrender. Brasidas was successful enough in his effort to make the politicians in Athens impatient, and finally Cleon offered to command a force himself to go and get the beleaguered but surviving Spartans off the island. The assembly took him up on this, and a force of 14,000 men was put under his command. That was thought what might be necessary to capture or kill 420 Spartans. No Spartan, it was said, had ever surrendered with his sword in his hand. And the story of the Spartans fighting to the last man at Thermopylae was one which everybody knew. No football team, it might be pointed out, has ever been called the Fighting Athenians. Nevertheless, Cleon and his force landed at the south end of the island and drove the Spartans up the hill, where at length 292 of the original 420 did surrender with the permission of Brasidas. This is a shield on display in the Agora Museum, which is said to be one of those taken from the Spartans on this occasion. This was the high point of Cleon's career, and a great day for Athens. 292 Spartans isn't many, but symbolically this was very important. And it wasn't just symbolically important either. The Athenians now threatened to execute these captives unless the siege of the city was ended, and the Spartans were forced thereby to withdraw. Cleon is often said to have been a blowhard demagogue, and Aristophanes makes him an immortal buffoon in his play The Knights, but he must have been more than that. He was clearly a brave man who could get things done, even if he lacked the charismatic charm of someone like Pericles. After the withdrawal of the Spartan army, the Athenians, with renewed but unwarranted confidence in their army, proposed to march out and punish Thebes, which had allied itself with Sparta during the siege. This resulted in the Battle of Delion here near the coast, about 30 miles north of Athens, in 424, the year after the fall of Sphacteria, and the Athenians were soundly defeated. The most memorable thing about the battle is the fact that, according to Plutarch, the Athenian Alcibiades saved the life of the infantryman Socrates, as Socrates is said to have saved his life at Potidaea. So although 14,000 Athenians had captured 292 Spartans, 27,000 of them couldn't beat 17,000 Thebans, and the Athenians were made to realize again their weakness on land and the importance of their fleet. In 422, the Spartans under Brasidas occupied Amphipolis here in what Athens regarded as its sphere of influence at the north end of the Aegean, and Cleon attacked it in the battle that ended the first half of the war. At one time, most of what is now land here was part of the Aegean, and the town was on hills surrounding the lowland in the center where the harbor was. The Athenians were unable to take the city, but both Cleon and Brasidas, the leading hawks on the two sides, were killed in the battle, which helped create the right atmosphere then for the signing of what came to be known as the Peace of Nicias, named after the Athenian negotiator involved. By this treaty, the Spartans gave Amphipolis to Athens, but the 292 Spartan captives from Sphacteria were to be returned in exchange. The historian Thucydides was blamed by the Athenians for having allowed the Spartans to occupy Amphipolis in the first place. As a strategos, he was in command of a fleet which was supposed to be on guard in the North Aegean, but somehow his ships were out of position when the Spartans showed up, and he was accused of having made some deal because his family owned gold mines in the area. This is thought to be the silver and gold ossuary of Brasidas, found in a tomb at Amphipolis. It's now in the Archaeological Museum there. Also, since 1964, a nearby colossal tumulus tomb, the largest such thing in Greece, has been undergoing excavation, and while several bodies and various artifacts have been discovered, it is still not certain who the primary beneficiary of this gigantic effort was, although there is some evidence that it was Hephaestion, the companion of Alexander the Great, about whom more next week. Here's a portrait of Thucydides now. He was exiled from Athens, but puts the best spin on this, saying that it gave him the opportunity to visit the Peloponnesus and do a better job in writing his history. He was allowed to return to Athens at the end of the war, however, but may have died by violence during the revolution that ousted the Spartan-supported government. Herodotus is called the father of history, but Thucydides is often considered more of an historian in the modern sense. Herodotus tends to write in the manner of a storyteller or a tour guide, maybe, while Thucydides is more concerned to be objective, more concerned, I think, anyway, although these things are relative. Thucydides is himself well known for interpolating speeches which he can have hardly taken down shorthand. The Peloponnesian War was, as wars go, not a very big world historical deal, sort of like a war between Fremont and Hayward or something. Herbert Muller calls it the silliest war on record, but in Thucydides' history it becomes an epic conflict. One of the first rules of art, of course, is that it's the genius that makes the masterpiece, not the subject. And I think Thucydides' history is an illustration of that point. In the museum at Delphi, you can see this helmet of the sort, worn by Greek soldiers in the 5th century. After the death of Cleon, Alcibiades became the most influential hawk in Athens, and he is, in fact, one of the most interesting characters in Greek history. He was a close friend of Socrates. Each had saved the life of the other, as I mentioned, but he didn't spend all his time discussing metaphysics. Plutarch tells a story that gives you a good idea of his personality. He was constantly the subject of political and social gossip because of his eccentric lifestyle, and Plutarch says one day he cut the tail off his handsome show dog, which had won lots of kennel club awards or something like that. When a friend asked him why on earth he had done this, which was sure to appall everyone, Alcibiades replied, "Mistreat a dog and people will forget everything else about you. For weeks, people will ignore everything else I've done and think only of my dog." And he was probably right about this. You remember what happened when LBJ picked his beagle up by the ears? Alcibiades' symbol, a sort of coat of arms, is also revealing. It was Cupid with a thunderbolt in his hand. The Peace of Nicias was arranged in 421 to last 50 years, but in 418 it collapsed after just 3. Alcibiades was able to win over the assembly to form an alliance with Argos, a Peloponnesian city in the Spartan sphere of influence, in direct violation of the terms of the peace. And this brought about a battle on the plain of Mantinea here just west of the Isthmus of Corinth in the Peloponnesus, and it resulted in a predictable Spartan victory over the Athenian army, which was led not by Alcibiades, but by the strategos Laches, who was killed on the field. Alcibiades' reputation temporarily did fall, but it was not long before he restored himself to favor, just in time to help lead Athens into the greatest disaster of the war. This is the fine Doric temple, which, along with the theater, is about all that remains of the ancient city of Segesta on Sicily. In 416, an embassy from Segesta arrived in Athens proposing to help financially support Athenian ambition in the West if Athenians would help in Segesta's own local political position. Athenian envoys were sent who were very impressed by the apparent wealth of the place, and it was decided that a fleet and army would be sent under the primary command of Nicias, who was unenthusiastic, however, about the whole project. Alcibiades, who had immediately been taken by what he regarded as an opportunity for adventure and conquest, was, along with a fellow named Lamachus, also to share in the command. Unfortunately, when the Athenians arrived, they discovered that the people of Segesta were far from as rich as they had pretended. They had gathered together as much loot as they could find in one house and invited the Athenian envoys to dinner there. Then they'd moved everything to another house and invited them there, and so on. We saw a helmet earlier of the sort worn during the Peloponnesian War, and this is a breastplate of the same era. It would have been too embarrassing to simply turn the whole fleet and army around and go home with nothing to show for the whole expedition except humiliation. So it was decided to attack Syracuse, which was allied with Sparta. The siege was begun, but then word arrived from Athens that Alcibiades was to be placed under arrest and returned to Athens because he'd been charged with mutilating religious images. On the return trip, he jumped ship and made his way to Sparta, where in revenge for his condemnation in Athens, he now proposed to help Sparta defeat the Athenians. How much help he gave them isn't clear. He became involved with the wife of the Spartan king Agis and fled Sparta to go next to Asia Minor, rapidly running out of places where his face wasn't on a wanted poster. Here's a view of Syracuse now with the ancient theater in the foreground. Thucydides' story of the epic siege of Syracuse is the masterpiece of his masterpiece, and we don't have time to tell much of the story here, but the essence of it is that the Athenians became ever more and more bogged down. The Spartans sent a general named Gylippus, who took command of the Syracusan forces, and he is usually given credit for their ultimate victory. 3 years after the siege began, the Athenian fleet was defeated in the harbor, and the army, with no way to get off the island, had to retreat inland, where almost the entire force of 30,000 men was lost. Those who were not killed were imprisoned in the Syracusan marble quarries, and very few ever saw Athens again. Nicias, Lamachus, and Demosthenes, 3 of the leading military men in Athens, were among the dead, and Alcibiades was worse than dead. He was now a traitor intriguing with the Persians. This is a portrait of him now. Having left Sparta for Asia Minor, he became friendly with the Persian satrap of Sardis, Tissaphernes, who had been loosely allied with Sparta by way of trying to win back some parts of the Aegean, now that Athens was hard pressed on all fronts. Although the motives and maneuvers of all the parties are hard to sort out, the bottom line is that in Athens, Alcibiades came to be regarded as the Persian connection who could at least keep Tissaphernes from helping the Spartans. While he did not immediately return to Athens, an Athenian fleet was put under his command with which he had great success, notably in 410 over the Spartan navy at Cyzicus in the last event recorded in the history of Thucydides. Our primary authority for the rest of the war is Xenophon, about whom we'll hear more shortly. Alcibiades finally returned to Athens in triumph in 407, but his very success in effect turned against him when the fleet under his command was defeated at Notium in 406 by the Spartan admiral Lysander. This was an unlooked-for reverse, and many thought the mercurial hero had turned his coat again. The Athenians had come to think that he couldn't lose unless he wanted to lose. He withdrew to a fort on the Hellespont. This is a portrait of the Spartan admiral Lysander, whose success at Notium was bad news for Athens, which had never worried much about the Spartan navy. In 405, his fleet took up a position at Aegospotami in the Hellespont, opposite the Athenian one under Conon, who had succeeded Alcibiades as commander-in-chief. The Athenians would sail over and challenge the Spartans to come out and fight. The Spartans would appear reluctant, and the Athenians would then sail back to their side, get drunk, and go to sleep on the beach. This happened several times until the Athenians were way overconfident, and the Spartans showed up unexpectedly, wrecked or captured most of the fleet, and killed all the Athenians they could catch. By coincidence, this took place near the fortress of Alcibiades, who warned the Athenians to no avail, that they were being foolish. A few months later, he himself was killed by unknown assailants. After the Battle of Mantinea, the Spartans had renewed the siege of Athens, and following the decisive defeat of the navy at Aegospotami, Lysander was able to blockade the harbor at Piraeus. In this picture you can see some fragments of the long walls still visible there. After a year-long siege now by sea and land, the city surrendered in 404, and while some of Athens' enemies were calling for terrible retribution, and many citizens feared the worst, Sparta proved a very generous winner by any standards. Athens was required to tear down the walls and to install a government of which Sparta approved, and that done, the Spartans simply went home. It's tempting to root for Athens in the Peloponnesian War. The whole story of it is told by Thucydides and Xenophon, who were Athenians, and of course all the great things produced there make one sympathetic. But from an objective viewpoint, it's certainly arguable that the illiterate and artless Spartans were the good guys. The government, known to history as the 30 Tyrants, which the Spartans set up, got little support from Sparta and less in Athens. Two Athenians, Anytus and Thrasybulus, set up a sort of government in exile at Phyle here north of Athens, and in 403 they led a rebel army which overthrew the tyrants. Critias, the leader of them, was killed and the democracy restored, while Sparta did little to prevent this. We'll hear more about Anytus and Critias when we get to Socrates next week, because Anytus was the fellow who led the prosecution against him, and one of the things held against Socrates was that he was a friend of Critias. This is a portrait of Xenophon now, who, as I mentioned earlier, is our main source for the story of the war after the history of Thucydides breaks off. Xenophon's own work ends with the so-called Second Battle of Mantinea in 362. Most people who know about Xenophon, however, associate him primarily with one of the great adventure stories of all time, the Anabasis, usually called, in translation, something like The Overland Journey or The Journey Up Country, The Adventure of the 10,000 Greeks. In 401, Cyrus, the brother of King Artaxerxes of Persia, was in revolt against him and came to Greece looking for mercenary help. There were lots of ex-soldiers after the Peloponnesian War willing to go, and he was able to put together an army of some 10,000, one of whom was Xenophon. They were led by a renegade Spartan soldier of fortune named Clearchus. This is a modern painting of the Battle of Cunaxa, in which, although the Greeks defeated Artaxerxes, Cyrus himself was killed. This created an awkward situation for the Greeks, made worse when Artaxerxes' general and ally, Tissaphernes, about whom we heard earlier, had Clearchus treacherously killed after promising to help the Greeks. It was then that Xenophon, who had really come on the expedition just as a kind of war correspondent volunteer, emerged as a natural leader and was able to guide the Greeks north to the Black Sea and thence to the Aegean. The Anabasis is a very valuable work on many levels and sort of stands to Greek the way Caesar's War in Gaul stands to Latin. It's written in the same straightforward, no-nonsense style that makes it one of the first great, complete works in its language to which most students are exposed. It's truly amazing, as I suggested earlier, what all was going on in Athens in the last half of the 5th century. In addition to the architecture and sculpture of the Acropolis project, an Athenian Thucydides produced, many would say, the greatest work of history ever written. Several of the most important philosophers ever were around, including Socrates and Plato, and what many, who are not English anyway, would call the greatest plays ever written were being staged in theaters like this, the Theater of Dionysus on the south slope of the Acropolis. And all this was going on during a war which threatened the very existence of the city. The Theater of Dionysus is probably, at least on the site of, the oldest stone theater in Greece, though the exact date of the place as it stands is not clear. The origins of Greek drama are usually said to be found in religious festivals, though some think that the oral recitation of poetry like the Iliad also may have led to something like theatrical performance. Thespis, a 6th century Athenian, is said to have written the first tragedies properly so called, but nothing by him survives, and the earliest play extant is probably the Persians by Aeschylus, thought to have been written about 475. The Persians and the other 6 plays by him which do survive do not strike one as at all primitive in any sense. They sort of stand to the history of drama the way the Temple of Hera at Olympia stands to the history of Greek architecture. All of a sudden, there you have it, a classic representative of its kind with nothing surviving that can really explain it. In the 5th century, plays were only performed here during the greater and lesser festivals of Dionysus, a total of 10 days out of the year. An archon was chosen to select the plays that would be performed and to assign sponsors. Judges were chosen by lot from a list nominated by the Council of 500. Aeschylus won first prize 11 times. This is the theatrical monument in Athens of a drama patron named Lysicrates. It's the most impressive surviving such thing by far and was put up to commemorate his sponsorship of a winning play in the 4th century. On the festival days in the 5th century, the plays would go on from sunrise to sunset and were regarded, as I mentioned at Delphi, as first of all offerings to and entertainment for the gods. Only in the 4th century did the theaters come into more general use on something like a year-round basis. You should also notice on this monument what may be the earliest surviving Corinthian columns. We'll hear more about this style, the Corinthian, in connection with Rome. This is the theater in the precinct of Asclepius, the god associated with medicine and healing at Epidaurus, and it is the most impressive Greek theater still surviving. It will still hold 14,000 people, virtually all of whom would have made a pilgrimage here during the local festival. It's about 40 miles from Athens across the Saronic Gulf, and a trip here would be sort of the ancient equivalent to going to Ashland, I guess. Music was a very important part of Greek theater, and most dramatists were in effect composers as well as writers. Considering the stylized nature of the performances, I think they might remind a modern theater goer more perhaps of opera than of, say, a performance at ACT or Berkeley Rep. You're hearing Gregorio Paniagua's attempt to reconstruct a fragment of music intended to accompany the play by Euripides called Orestes. But as I've said before, it's very difficult to reconstruct this kind of thing. This is another view of Epidaurus from the cheap seats. Actually, they were all cheap. Admission was free during most such festivals, but the mechanics of how seating worked and so on aren't clearly understood. Some accounts indicate that the audiences often behaved more like the crowd at a Raiders game than at the San Francisco Opera, though. HDF Kiddo says that Greek drama is great, but that the Greeks would have welcomed something worse if it had been available. The word tragedy comes from roots meaning goat song because the first prize was a goat. So few playwrights probably got rich, I think, and I don't think I would even have cared what second prize was. The subjects of these tragedies were always drawn from mythology, and again, as in Elizabethan drama, the audience was expected to know the plot, at least in outline. People knew what was coming. The art lay in the language, the presentation of the story. There were no surprise endings. There were consequently no ordinary people in these plays either. The death of a salesman would not have been thought a proper subject. Here you are looking up from the stage level. It's a little hard to believe people could really hear the actors. 14,000 people make a lot of noise even when they're trying to be quiet. And you think the chairs in class are uncomfortable? Try sitting on a stone bench for 3 hours. There must have been more than a little fidgeting. I mentioned the origin of our word tragedy, and a lot of other Greek words of theatrical origin have survived into modern English. The main actor was called the protagonist. The set behind the actors was called the skene, whence our word scene. Our word hypocrite comes from the Greek hippokrates, which means actor. And English words like person, personality, and impersonate come from the Greek word persona, which designated the actor's mask. This is a portrait of Aeschylus himself now. 7 of his plays survive, as I said, including the only complete trilogy we still have, the Oresteia, as it's called, consisting of Agamemnon, the Coephori, or libation bearers, and the Eumenides. These plays all concerned with events following the Trojan War. It's difficult to generalize about the nature, the purposes, and effects of Greek tragedy. Aristotle thought its value lay, at least in part, in the way it allows us to experience emotions which might be dangerous to us in real life. Plotinus, the late Roman philosopher, thought drama and all aesthetic experience similar to mystical experience. It takes us out of ourselves and unites us with something larger or at least different. In less metaphysical language, it just allows what we can experience as individuals to be broadened. This is Sophocles, by whom we also have just 7 plays, though we know that, like Aeschylus, he apparently wrote in the neighborhood of 100 and won 18 goats. He's the author of Antigone, as well as the Oedipus plays, which are among the most well-known of all plays. Hegel thought that the essence of tragedy lay in the confrontation of irreconcilable opposites, conflicting moral principles, both of which demand our loyalty, and Antigone fits this model pretty well, but most tragedies are hard to interpret this way. Sophocles won the first prize over Aeschylus in 468 at the Festival of Dionysus, after which time he became the most celebrated playwright in Greece for some 50 years, and many still consider him the greatest of Greek dramatists. The Athenians were so impressed with Antigone that he was elected a strategos in 440. Eventually, I suppose even actors may have been elected to public office. To return to the nature of Greek drama, in general, I think the fact that it was intended as entertainment for the gods is important to notice. If you were a god, what would you like to see? Well, probably plays in which everything is really in your hands. Plays written on the theme that man proposes but God disposes. And in fact, if there is a basic theme to Greek tragedy, that may be it. The Oresteia ends with the line, "All-seeing Zeus hath wrought this happy end." The last words of Philoctetes in Sophocles' play about him are, "I am born by mighty fate and by the God who brought these things to fulfillment." This is a portrait of Euripides, the third great Greek tragedian, who is often described as an anti-religious rationalist and certainly seems to be ridiculing the gods as well as heroes, oracles, soothsayers, and so on in many of his plays, although he too pays lip service to the idea that gods are, or fate is, in control of our destiny, or at least in any case we aren't. Medea is probably his most well-known play, and several others also have women in the title roles. This now is Aristophanes, the greatest of the Greek comic playwrights, although he doesn't look very cheerful in this portrait. And we're also hearing a fragment of a piece of music attributed to him that accompanied one of his comedies. He is often considered the finest among the dramatists as a composer. Greek tragedy has no comic relief to speak of, unlike even the most serious of Shakespeare's tragedies. But during the festivals, there were performances of comedies as well as tragedies. It's a measure of how free thought and speech were in Athens that even in the middle of the Peloponnesian War, Aristophanes could survive making the very popular Cleon a laughingstock. Cleon in effect sued him for this, and Aristophanes was required to pay a fine for lampooning him in a now lost play. But in the Knights he also comes off just as badly. In that play, a citizen says that he's, Cleon, nothing but a boastful, bragging blowhard with no capacity for reason. And his companion says, "Oh, swell, a perfect politician, I'll vote for him." In fact, I think that Aristophanes is really the earliest surviving writer we can be sure is trying to be funny. And he can be very funny. In his play The Clouds, he makes fun of Socrates. A pretentious would-be philosopher named Strepsiades comes to learn from the great thinker, and when he arrives, he says, "I am here, Socrates, and I feel the need to excogitate." Socrates looks a little taken aback and tells him, "Well, if you have to excogitate, please go outside. Don't do it in my house." Okay, on that high point in the history of Greek drama, we'll close this lecture and go on next time to hear about Socrates himself, Plato, Aristotle, and Alexander the Great, among other heroes. Bye.